I'm Rebecca Montgomery, 27 years old, and I'm standing outside my family's mansion in 10-degree weather wearing nothing but a thin Christmas dress. My father just locked me out because I refused to sign away my inheritance from my dead billionaire grandfather. The snow is cutting into my bare arms like razor blades, and I can't feel my toes anymore. My phone is inside, along with my coat and any hope of survival through this brutal Christmas Eve night. But then I felt this impossible warmth behind me, and I heard a voice I thought I'd never hear again calling my name. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever felt betrayed by family, and don't forget to subscribe because this story will blow your mind. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next when my supposedly dead grandfather shows up to save my life. 3 weeks before that nightmare Christmas Eve, I was sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of Whitmore, Sterling and Associates, listening to my grandfather Harrison Montgomery's will being read. The leather chair felt cold beneath me as Mr. Whitmore's voice echoed through the room, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to hear. My grandfather, who had built a tech empire worth over $2 billion, had left everything to me. Not to my father Thomas, not split among family members, but entirely to me. I watched my father's face turn from confident expectation to shocked disbelief, then to something much darker. Thomas Montgomery had been telling me for years that his father hated me, that I was a disappointment who would never amount to anything. He'd painted himself as the long-suffering son who deserved everything after putting up with the old man's demanding ways. But as Mr. Whitmore continued reading, it became clear that my grandfather had seen through Thomas's lies completely. The will specifically mentioned Thomas's gambling problems, his failed business ventures, and his attempts to manipulate the family for financial gain. It detailed how Harrison had been watching Thomas destroy every opportunity he'd been given, from the trust fund he'd blown through by age 30 to the company positions he'd lost due to embezzlement attempts. My grandfather had documented everything, and he'd made sure Thomas would never get his hands on the family fortune. That evening at dinner, the tension in our sprawling dining room was suffocating. Thomas sat at the head of the table where grandfather used to sit, cutting his steak with violent precision. My stepmother Janet kept shooting me hostile glances while picking at her salad, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass in irritation. Even my half-brother Marcus seemed different, avoiding eye contact and responding to my attempts at conversation with single-word answers. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I set down my fork and looked directly at my father, demanding to know why he'd lied to me about grandfather's feelings. Thomas's mask slipped completely then, and the man I'd feared but still loved revealed himself to be something far worse than I'd imagined. He told me about the gambling debts, how he owed dangerous people more money than I could comprehend. He'd been using our family home as collateral, borrowing against an inheritance he'd assumed would be his. Janet jumped to his defense immediately, her voice shrill as she accused me of being an ungrateful daughter who didn't understand the sacrifices they'd made. She reminded me that they'd housed me, fed me, educated me, and that I owed them everything. Her words felt like poison in the air, twisting years of what I'd thought was family loyalty into something ugly and manipulative. Marcus finally spoke up, but only to agree with them, saying I should think about the family's needs before my own selfish desires. The evening ended with Thomas leaning across the table, his face red with anger and desperation, demanding that I sign power of attorney documents that would give him control over the inheritance. When I refused, the man who had raised me looked me in the eyes and said words that chilled me to the bone. "You'll regret crossing this family, Rebecca. We made you, and we can destroy you just as easily." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and I knew my life was about to change forever. The campaign against me started the very next morning with surgical precision. Thomas had always been charming when he wanted something, and now he deployed that charm like a weapon against me. He began by calling every family member we had, painting me as a greedy, manipulative daughter who had somehow tricked my grandfather into changing his will. The lies flowed from his mouth so smoothly that I almost believed them myself. Cousin Daniel was the first to turn. He'd been like a brother to me growing up, the one person I could count on during family gatherings when the adults were drinking too much and saying things they shouldn't. But when I called him hoping for support, his voice was cold and distant. He told me he'd heard about my behavior, how I'd been manipulating our grandfather in his final years, playing on his loneliness to secure my position as his heir. The accusations stung because they were so far from the truth, but Daniel delivered them with such conviction that I began to doubt my own memories. Aunt Margaret, Thomas's sister, was next. She cornered me at the grocery store 2 days later, her voice loud enough for everyone in the produce section to hear as she called me selfish and money-hungry. She told anyone who would listen that I was tearing the family apart with my greed, that I should be ashamed of myself for keeping money that rightfully belonged to my father. Her performance was so convincing that other shoppers started staring at me with disgust, and I had to leave my cart full of groceries and flee the store in humiliation. But the real knife in my back came from Janet's methodical destruction of my credibility at home. She began planting evidence of theft, moving small valuable items from around the house and then accusing me of taking them. An antique silver letter opener went missing from Thomas's study, and suddenly Janet was tearfully telling neighbors that she didn't feel safe in her own home anymore. Family photographs disappeared from their frames, and Janet suggested that I was probably selling them online to spite everyone. The discovery that broke my heart completely came when I found Marcus in my room one evening, carefully placing a small recording device back into my jewelry box. My 16-year-old half-brother, the kid I'd helped with homework and driven to soccer practice, had been spying on me for weeks. When I confronted him, he couldn't even look at me as he explained that Thomas had promised him a new car and college tuition if he gathered evidence of my unstable behavior and threats against the family. Thomas had been intercepting my mail for weeks, I discovered, including important documents from grandfather's lawyers and financial advisors. Every attempt I made to contact the legal team handling the estate was somehow blocked or delayed. When I tried to call Mr. Whitmore directly, his secretary told me that Thomas had already been in contact and that all communications would need to go through him as the family representative. I was being systematically isolated from any support system I might have had. The psychological warfare escalated when Thomas destroyed my childhood photo albums, claiming he needed to clear out unnecessary clutter from the house. Watching my memories burn in the backyard fire pit felt like watching my identity disappear in smoke. These weren't just pictures, they were proof that I had once belonged somewhere, that I had been loved and valued. Thomas stood watching the flames with a satisfied smile, and I realized that destroying those photos wasn't random cruelty, it was strategic elimination of anything that might anchor me to positive family memories. The isolation was working exactly as Thomas had planned. Extended family members stopped returning my calls, neighbors looked at me with suspicion, and I found myself completely alone within what had once been my support system. Every conversation felt like a trap, every family interaction became an opportunity for someone to gather more ammunition against me. I was living in a house full of enemies, and the walls were closing in with each passing day. Thomas's first major strike came on a Tuesday morning when I was getting ready for work at the marketing firm where I'd been building my career for 3 years. The police arrived at my office building just as I was settling into my cubicle with my morning coffee, their presence causing heads to turn throughout the open workspace. My supervisor approached my desk with a grim expression, informing me that I was being arrested for theft of family property worth over $50,000. The accusations were devastating in their specificity. Thomas had filed a police report claiming that I had stolen a collection of antique jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, pieces that had supposedly been in the family for generations. He provided detailed descriptions of each item, along with photographs and appraisal documents that seemed to prove their value and his ownership. What made the charges particularly damaging was that Thomas had convinced other family members to provide sworn statements supporting his version of events. Aunt Margaret gave a tearful statement to police about how she'd seen me acting suspiciously around the jewelry box during family gatherings. Uncle Robert, grandfather's own brother, told investigators that he'd noticed valuable items going missing whenever I visited the house. Even Marcus, my own half-brother, provided a statement claiming he'd overheard me talking about selling family heirlooms to get money quickly. The web of lies was so comprehensive that even I began to question whether I might have somehow forgotten taking something. The bail hearing was a nightmare of public humiliation. Thomas appeared in court playing the role of the heartbroken father, explaining to the judge how difficult it was to see his own daughter destroy the family this way. He spoke about my supposed mental health issues, my history of erratic behavior, and my recent obsession with money since learning about the inheritance. His performance was so convincing that I could see doubt creeping into my own lawyer's eyes as she listened to the accusations. The bail was set at $25,000, forcing me to drain my emergency savings account just to avoid spending Christmas in jail. But the damage to my reputation was already done. My employer placed me on indefinite suspension pending the outcome of the criminal charges, effectively ending my career at the company I'd hoped to grow with. Colleagues who had been friends suddenly avoided me in the parking lot, and I could feel their whispered conversations following me wherever I went. The personal attacks came next with brutal efficiency. Jake, my boyfriend of 8 months, ended our relationship with a cold text message that offered no explanation or opportunity for discussion. When I tried calling him, his phone went straight to voicemail every time. I drove to his apartment, desperate for answers, only to have him refuse to open the door while shouting through it that he never wanted to see me again. It wasn't until weeks later that I discovered Thomas had offered him $15,000 to disappear from my life permanently. My landlord delivered the eviction notice personally, explaining that he'd received troubling information about my character in criminal charges. The lease agreement had a morality clause that allowed him to terminate tenancy if criminal activity was suspected, and Thomas had made sure he knew about every detail of the accusations against me. Other tenants in the building started treating me like a pariah, crossing to the other side of hallways to avoid any contact with the alleged criminal in their midst. With nowhere else to turn, I was forced to move back into the family home, directly into Thomas's control. He presented this as his generous offer to help me during my difficult time, but I knew it was really about having me where he could monitor and manipulate me more effectively. The moment I walked through the front door with my suitcase, Thomas handed me a new set of legal documents transferring my inheritance rights to him, claiming it was the only way to save the family from further embarrassment and legal troubles. His smile as he offered me the pen was triumphant and cruel, the expression of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. He genuinely believed that he had broken me completely, that the combination of criminal charges, job loss, social isolation, and financial pressure would force me to surrender everything my grandfather had left me. But Thomas had underestimated my grandfather's influence, and he had no idea that the old man had prepared for exactly this kind of betrayal. Living back in the family home revealed the true depths of their conspiracy against me. Within days of my return, I began experiencing strange symptoms that I initially attributed to stress from the criminal charges and job loss. I felt constantly drowsy despite sleeping poorly, my thoughts seemed fuzzy and disconnected, and I had difficulty concentrating on even simple tasks. It wasn't until I accidentally spilled my morning orange juice and saw Janet quickly disposing of the glass without offering to pour me another that I began to suspect something sinister. I started paying closer attention to my food and drinks, and the pattern became clear. Every meal that Janet prepared or served to me left me feeling disoriented and exhausted within an hour. When I began skipping family meals and eating only food I prepared myself, the symptoms disappeared completely. Janet was drugging me with anxiety medication, keeping me in a constant state of mental fog that made it difficult to think clearly or plan any kind of defense against their attacks. Marcus's confession came during one of his brief moments of guilt. He found me in the garden one evening, sitting on the bench where grandfather used to tell me stories about building his company from nothing. My half-brother looked younger than his 16 years as he admitted that he'd been recording our conversations for weeks, not just gathering evidence but actually creating fabricated recordings using audio editing software that Thomas had taught him to use. The smartphone in his pocket had been capturing every word I said, providing raw material for Thomas to twist into incriminating statements. The revelation that shattered any remaining faith I had in family bonds came from an unexpected source. Uncle Robert, grandfather's younger brother, appeared at my bedroom window one night after climbing the old oak tree we'd used as children. His weathered face was etched with shame as he explained that Thomas had been forging documents for months, creating false records of debts that grandfather supposedly owed to various family members. Robert had initially believed Thomas's claims about being owed money from old business dealings, but he'd started investigating when the numbers didn't add up. According to Robert, Thomas had fabricated an entire paper trail showing that grandfather had borrowed heavily from family members to fund his final business ventures, money that was never repaid and now represented claims against the estate. The forged promissory notes, loan agreements, and bank transfer records were sophisticated enough to fool casual examination, and Thomas had been pressuring family members to support these false claims in exchange for shares of what they thought they were owed. But the betrayal that cut deepest came from discovering that Sarah, my college roommate and closest friend, had been feeding information about me to Thomas for over a year. She'd been visiting me regularly, asking detailed questions about my relationship with grandfather, my financial situation, and my future plans. I'd confided in her about my dreams of using inheritance money to start a non-profit organization, never realizing that every conversation was being reported back to Thomas as evidence of my grandiose delusions and unrealistic expectations. Thomas's next move was his most desperate and dangerous yet. He arranged for Dr. Williams, our longtime family physician, to visit the house under the pretense of checking on my mental health following the stress of the criminal charges. During what I thought was a routine consultation, Dr. Williams asked leading questions about my emotional state, my sleep patterns, and my thoughts about the future. His gentle demeanor masked the fact that he was building a case for involuntary commitment, documenting supposed evidence of depression, anxiety, and delusional thinking. The commitment papers were already prepared when I discovered them hidden in Thomas's study. Dr. Williams had falsified my medical records to show a history of mental instability, including fabricated reports of self-harm threats and episodes of violent behavior toward family members. The plan was to have me declared mentally incompetent, which would automatically transfer control of my inheritance to my next of kin, namely, Thomas as my father and closest relative. I barely escaped the mental health facility transport by hiding in the mansion's old servant quarters, a network of narrow rooms and passageways that most people had forgotten existed. From my hiding place, I could hear Thomas raging through the house with 2 orderlies and a psychiatric nurse, demanding that they find me and complete the commitment process. The sound of his voice, filled with fury at my escape, revealed the true monster that had been hiding behind years of paternal concern. During my hours in hiding, I discovered that Thomas had been planning my destruction since the moment grandfather died. Hidden in the servant quarters were boxes of documents that revealed the scope of his scheme: forged medical records, fabricated witness statements, altered legal documents, and detailed timelines for systematically destroying my credibility and isolating me from any potential supporters. This wasn't impulsive greed, it was calculated destruction of his own daughter. The physical violence started that same night when Thomas finally found my hiding place. His rage at being outmaneuvered boiled over into direct assault as he grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me violently, screaming that I was going to destroy the entire family with my selfishness. When I tried to get away from him, he shoved me down the main staircase, 23 wooden steps that I tumbled down like a broken doll while he watched from above. From the bottom of the stairs, bruised and bleeding with a sprained ankle and damaged ribs, I looked up at Thomas standing in the golden light of the chandelier. His expression wasn't concern or regret, it was calculation, already working out how to explain my injuries as another sign of my mental instability. He called down to ask if I'd learned my lesson about defying him, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who no longer saw me as human. The fall down the stairs left me physically broken and completely at Thomas's mercy. My ankle was badly sprained, my ribs ached with every breath, and purple bruises covered my arms and back where I'd hit the wooden steps. But Thomas spun the incident as proof of my deteriorating mental state, telling Janet and Marcus that I'd thrown myself down the stairs in a dramatic attempt to gain sympathy. Even the physical evidence of his violence was being used against me. Janet took control of my medical care, insisting that I didn't need professional treatment and that she could handle my injuries herself. She locked me in my childhood bedroom, claiming it was for my own protection while I recovered, but I knew it was really about maintaining complete control over my movements and communications. The lock was installed on the outside of the door, trapping me in a room that had once been my sanctuary but now felt like a prison cell. My phone had been confiscated, my laptop removed, and any means of contacting the outside world eliminated. Thomas controlled every aspect of my existence now, when I ate, what I ate, whether I could use the bathroom, even whether I could have water. The psychological torture of complete dependency was almost worse than the physical injuries, reducing me to begging for basic human needs from people who clearly enjoyed my suffering. But during my darkest hours, trapped in that bedroom with nothing but pain and despair for company, I discovered something that Thomas didn't know existed. Hidden behind a loose baseboard in my closet were letters that Grandfather had written to me before his death, letters that had never been delivered because Thomas had been intercepting my mail even then. The aged envelopes contained revelations that changed everything I thought I knew about my situation. Grandfather had been documenting Thomas's criminal activities for years, not just the gambling and failed businesses, but actual crimes including embezzlement from family companies, tax fraud, and attempts to manipulate elderly clients at his various jobs. The letters revealed that Harrison had been building a legal case against Thomas, working with federal investigators to gather evidence of financial crimes that could result in serious prison time. More importantly, the letters mentioned an insurance policy that Grandfather had put in place specifically to protect me from Thomas's inevitable attempts to steal my inheritance. He'd hidden evidence in multiple locations, including a secret safe in the mansion that contained documents proving Thomas's guilt and recordings of his confessions to various crimes. Grandfather had anticipated exactly this kind of betrayal and had prepared countermeasures that Thomas knew nothing about. The groundskeeper, Miguel Hernandez, became my unexpected ally when he noticed that I hadn't been seen around the property for days. Miguel had worked for our family for over 20 years and had been particularly close to Grandfather, maintaining the extensive gardens and grounds that Harrison had loved so much. When he learned about my situation from whispered conversations with household staff, Miguel risked his job by secretly bringing me food and medical supplies. Miguel revealed that Grandfather had trusted him with certain information before his death, including the location of the hidden safe and instructions for what to do if Thomas ever tried to harm me. The loyalty between Grandfather and Miguel ran deeper than employer and employee. They had been genuine friends who shared a love of the land and a concern for family legacy. Miguel's weathered hands shook as he told me about promises he'd made to the old man about protecting me. His daughter Sophia was a civil rights attorney in the city, someone who specialized in cases involving family abuse and financial exploitation. Miguel arranged for her to visit under the pretense of delivering landscaping contracts, giving us an opportunity to discuss legal options for fighting back against Thomas's conspiracy. But Sophia warned me that we needed concrete evidence, not just accusations, to have any chance of success against someone with Thomas's resources and influence. The most crucial revelation came when Miguel told me about Grandfather's private study, a hidden room in the mansion's basement that Thomas had never discovered. Harrison had used this space to store his most sensitive documents and to conduct confidential business meetings away from family interference. According to Miguel, this room contained everything I needed to destroy Thomas's credibility and expose his crimes, but reaching it would require escaping my locked bedroom prison. Christmas Eve arrived with a sense of approaching doom that made my injuries ache even more than usual. Thomas had been making increasingly desperate phone calls to unknown parties, and I could hear him pacing in his study late into the night. The gambling debts were apparently coming due, and his creditors were no longer accepting promises of future payment. I was the only thing standing between him and financial ruin, which meant he was about to make his final, most desperate move. The ultimatum came at Christmas dinner, delivered with the false warmth of family tradition while every word carried the weight of a death threat. Thomas announced that I would be signing over my inheritance rights that evening, not as a request but as a statement of fact. The documents were already prepared, witnesses had been arranged, and my cooperation was no longer optional. The mask of paternal concern had finally been discarded completely, revealing the predator who had been hiding beneath it all along. The Christmas dinner that should have been a celebration of family togetherness became the stage for Thomas's final assault on my inheritance and my life. The dining room had been decorated with grandfather's antique ornaments, a cruel touch that reminded everyone of the fortune that was at stake. Thomas sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, flanked by Janet and the family members he'd recruited to his cause through lies and manipulation. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Robert flanked me on either side, their presence feeling more like guards than dinner companions. The table was set with grandmother's china and crystal, expensive pieces that Thomas had already mentally claimed as his own. Every detail of the evening had been orchestrated to demonstrate his power and my helplessness, from the seating arrangement that isolated me to the formal atmosphere that made casual conversation impossible. Thomas began his announcement with false concern for my welfare, expressing how worried he'd been about my mental state and my inability to handle the responsibility that grandfather had placed on my shoulders. He spoke about family loyalty and sacrifice, about the importance of considering everyone's needs rather than acting selfishly. His words were carefully chosen to make his demands sound reasonable and my resistance appear childish and ungrateful. The documents were already prepared and waiting on the sideboard, thick legal papers that would transfer complete control of my inheritance to Thomas while leaving me with a small monthly allowance for my own protection. He explained that this arrangement would ensure I was cared for throughout my life while allowing the family to use grandfather's wealth responsibly for everyone's benefit. The condescension in his voice made it clear that he viewed me as a child incapable of managing my own affairs. Marcus played his assigned role perfectly, producing a recording device and announcing that he had proof of my unstable mental state. The audio he played for the table was a masterfully edited compilation of my voice saying things I'd never actually said, confessing to theft and expressing hatred for the family that had raised me. His technical skills had created evidence that sounded completely authentic, and I watched family members' faces change as they listened to what they believed were my own words condemning me. My response was to reveal everything I'd learned about Thomas's gambling debts and criminal activities, information that I'd gathered from the intercepted letters and my conversations with Miguel. I detailed the specific amounts he owed to various creditors, the threats that had been made against our family's safety, and the timeline of his increasingly desperate attempts to gain access to grandfather's money. The shocked expressions around the table told me that most family members had no idea how deep Thomas's problems really ran. Janet's reaction was immediate and vicious, her carefully maintained facade of maternal concern disappearing as she launched into a verbal attack that revealed her true feelings about me. She called me an ungrateful daughter who had never appreciated the sacrifices they'd made, a manipulative child who was trying to destroy the family out of spite. Her voice rose to a shriek as she accused me of mental illness, claiming that my refusal to help Thomas proved that I was dangerously unstable and needed professional intervention. The confrontation escalated when Thomas's carefully planned presentation began falling apart. Family members started asking uncomfortable questions about his debts and his previous failed ventures. Uncle Robert demanded to see the original documents that supposedly proved grandfather owed money to family members. Aunt Margaret began questioning why Thomas needed complete control rather than a more equitable distribution of assets among all family members. Thomas's temper finally snapped when he realized that his manipulation wasn't working as planned. Years of contained rage and desperation exploded into violence as he lunged across the table toward me, his face twisted with fury and his hands reaching for my throat. The crystal glasses and china plates crashed to the floor as his weight hit the table, sending expensive family heirlooms shattering into pieces that seemed to symbolize our destroyed relationships. The physical struggle was brief but brutal. Thomas was larger and stronger than me, and my injuries from the staircase fall made it impossible to defend myself effectively. He grabbed my arms hard enough to leave fresh bruises over the old ones, shaking me violently while screaming that I was going to destroy everything he'd worked for. His grip tore my dress and left marks on my skin that would serve as evidence of his assault, though I didn't know at the time that anyone would ever care about proving what he'd done to me. When I continued to refuse to sign the documents, Thomas made a decision that revealed the true depths of his hatred and desperation. He dragged me to the front door, his hands rough and unforgiving as he forced me outside into the brutal December cold. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and I was wearing only the thin dress that had been torn during our struggle. My coat, phone, and any means of survival remained inside the house that had been locked against me. Standing on the front steps in the cutting wind, I could hear Thomas through the heavy wooden door explaining to the family that I needed time to think about my selfishness and the consequences of my decisions. He told them that I could come back inside as soon as I was ready to sign the papers and apologize for disrupting Christmas dinner. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who genuinely believed that freezing to death was a reasonable consequence for disobedience. The cold hit my exposed skin like a physical attack, and I knew that I had minutes rather than hours before hypothermia set in. The mansion's windows glowed warmly with electric light, showing me the family gathering I'd been expelled from, the dinner that was probably continuing without any concern for my survival. Thomas had finally revealed the monster that grandfather had seen years ago, the man who would literally kill his own daughter rather than accept defeat. The cold was killing me slowly, each gust of wind feeling like razor blades against my exposed skin, when something impossible happened that changed everything. I felt warmth behind me, not the gradual warmth of shelter but an immediate, penetrating heat that seemed to come from nowhere. The sensation was so sudden and unexpected that I turned around, expecting to find someone with a coat or blanket, but instead I saw a figure that made my heart stop completely. Harrison Montgomery stood behind me exactly as I remembered him from life, tall and distinguished with silver hair that caught the moonlight and eyes that sparkled with the intelligence that had built his empire from nothing. He wore the dark wool coat he'd favored during winter walks around the property, and his presence radiated the same quiet authority that had commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals. But this was impossible because I'd watched them lower his coffin into the ground 8 months ago. Grandfather's voice was exactly as I remembered it, warm and reassuring with the slight accent that revealed his humble origins in rural Kentucky. He told me that he'd been watching Thomas destroy our family piece by piece, and he wasn't going to stand by while his son committed murder to steal money that had never belonged to him. The old man's anger was controlled but intense, the same focused fury that had driven him to build his business empire and that now motivated him to protect me from beyond the grave. He explained that death hadn't ended his connection to the family he'd built, especially not to the granddaughter who had inherited his values along with his fortune. Harrison had been present during every one of Thomas's attacks against me, watching helplessly as his son revealed himself to be everything that grandfather had feared he might become. But tonight, with my life literally hanging in the balance, the barriers between life and death had become thin enough for him to intervene directly. Grandfather revealed that he'd been preparing for Thomas's betrayal long before his death, creating multiple layers of protection that his son knew nothing about. The hidden safe in the mansion's basement contained evidence that would destroy Thomas completely, but more importantly, Harrison had been working with federal investigators for years to build a case against his son's criminal activities. The inheritance was protected by legal mechanisms that made it impossible for anyone to steal, regardless of what documents Thomas might force me to sign. The revelation that stunned me most was that grandfather had been aware of every detail of Thomas's conspiracy against me. He'd watched Thomas forge documents, bribe witnesses, and manipulate family members into supporting his lies. Harrison knew about the drugging, the false police reports, the attempts at involuntary commitment, and every other crime that had been committed in pursuit of my inheritance. He'd been gathering evidence of everything, building a case that would ensure justice for what had been done to me. Grandfather guided me to a section of the mansion's exterior wall where the old servant's entrance was hidden behind overgrown ivy. This door had been sealed for decades, but Harrison's spirit somehow unlocked it, allowing me access to corridors that Thomas had forgotten existed. The warmth that surrounded me intensified as we moved through the house, protecting me from the cold that should have been fatal by now. The hidden study in the basement was exactly as Grandfather had described it, a sophisticated office space that Thomas had never discovered despite living in the house for his entire adult life. The room contained filing cabinets full of evidence, recording equipment that had captured years of Thomas's confessions to various crimes, and multiple safes containing documents that proved his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Harrison had been building a case against his own son for years, hoping he'd never need to use it but prepared for exactly this kind of betrayal. The security system that Grandfather revealed was beyond anything I could have imagined. Hidden cameras throughout the mansion had been recording everything for months, capturing Thomas's violence toward me, his conspiracy meetings with Janet and Marcus, and his attempts to forge legal documents. The basement study contained monitors showing real-time footage from every room in the house, proof that Harrison had been watching and protecting me even when I thought I was completely alone. But the most powerful evidence was contained in Grandfather's private journals, detailed accounts of Thomas's criminal activities written in Harrison's own hand and supported by photographs, bank records, and witness statements. These documents revealed that Thomas had been stealing from family businesses for decades, embezzling money from elderly clients during his various employment positions, and using his charm to manipulate vulnerable people out of their life savings. The inheritance scheme was just the latest in a long pattern of criminal behavior. Grandfather's spirit showed me how to access digital files that contained recordings of Thomas confessing to various crimes, including his plan to have me committed to a mental institution and his willingness to let me freeze to death rather than accept defeat. These recordings, combined with the physical evidence in the study, created an overwhelming case that would send Thomas to prison for the rest of his life while ensuring that I retained complete control over my inheritance. The final revelation was that Harrison had been working directly with FBI agents who specialized in financial crimes and family abuse cases. The investigation into Thomas's activities had been ongoing for years, with Grandfather serving as a confidential informant who provided evidence of his son's criminal behavior. The federal case was ready to proceed as soon as I provided the final piece of evidence, which was my own testimony about the crimes that had been committed against me personally. As dawn approached, Grandfather's presence began to fade, but not before he told me exactly what I needed to do to claim justice and reclaim my life. The evidence in the hidden study would destroy Thomas completely, but I needed to be strategic about how I revealed it to ensure maximum impact and minimum danger to myself. Harrison's final words were a promise that he would continue watching over me, and that Thomas's reign of terror was about to end forever. Armed with Grandfather's evidence and guided by his strategic wisdom, I began the systematic destruction of Thomas's criminal empire. The first call I made was to Sofia Hernandez, Miguel's daughter, whose civil rights practice had prepared her for exactly this kind of complex abuse case. Sofia arrived at the mansion before dawn with federal agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, investigators who had been waiting years for the opportunity to move against Thomas with ironclad evidence. The recording equipment in Grandfather's hidden study had captured everything Thomas needed to incriminate himself, including detailed conversations about his plans to have me murdered if the inheritance scheme failed. Special Agent Patricia Matthews, who had been building the federal case against Thomas, explained that they'd been waiting for him to commit crimes serious enough to justify a major prosecution. Attempted murder and inheritance fraud were more than sufficient to ensure a life sentence. Thomas was completely unprepared when federal agents surrounded the mansion at 6 a.m, executing search warrants that gave them access to every room and document in the house. His shock at seeing me alive and accompanied by law enforcement was so complete that he initially seemed unable to speak or move. The man who had spent months orchestrating my destruction stood frozen in his silk pajamas while agents seized computers, financial records, and physical evidence of his crimes. The confrontation with the assembled family was a masterpiece of strategic revelation. Sophia had arranged for the most damning evidence to be presented in chronological order, starting with Thomas's gambling debts and building toward his attempted murder of his own daughter. The recordings of his confessions played on speakers throughout the dining room where we'd had our Christmas Eve dinner, letting everyone hear his true voice admitting to crimes that destroyed any remaining family loyalty. Marcus broke down completely when faced with evidence of how Thomas had manipulated and threatened him into participating in the conspiracy. My 16-year-old half-brother confessed through tears that Thomas had promised him college tuition and a car while simultaneously threatening to hurt his mother if he didn't cooperate with the scheme. The revelation that Thomas had been abusing Marcus as well created another layer of federal charges while generating sympathy for a child who had been coerced into criminal activity. Janet's attempt to flee the scene created dramatic evidence of her guilt and consciousness of wrongdoing. Security cameras captured her trying to destroy documents in Thomas's study while federal agents were still arriving at the property. Her arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and assault charges related to drugging me added years to her potential sentence while eliminating any possibility that she could claim ignorance of Thomas's criminal activities. Uncle Robert's reaction to learning the truth about Thomas's manipulation was particularly satisfying. The older man had believed Thomas's lies about grandfather owing money to family members, but the evidence of forged documents and fabricated debts enraged him beyond measure. Robert provided additional testimony about Thomas's attempts to manipulate other family members into supporting false claims against the estate, adding conspiracy charges to an already overwhelming case. Daniel's apology was genuine but painful, revealing how completely Thomas had poisoned family relationships with his lies. My cousin explained that Thomas had threatened his mother's struggling business with financial ruin if Daniel didn't support the family's position against me. The manipulation had extended far beyond immediate family members, creating a web of coercion and intimidation that affected dozens of people who had trusted Thomas's version of events. The revelation about Jake, my ex-boyfriend who had been bribed to abandon me, provided additional evidence of Thomas's systematic campaign to isolate me from potential supporters. Jake's bank records showed the $15,000 payment he'd received for breaking up with me and refusing to take my calls. His cooperation with federal investigators earned him immunity from prosecution, but the knowledge that someone I'd loved had been bought like a commodity left emotional scars that would take years to heal. The arrival of Thomas's gambling creditors in the middle of the federal raid created chaos that perfectly illustrated the desperation behind his crimes. 3 dangerous-looking men appeared at the mansion demanding immediate payment of over $200,000 in gambling debts, money that Thomas had promised to pay using inheritance funds that had never belonged to him. Their threats and intimidation tactics were captured on security cameras, providing additional evidence of the external pressures that had driven Thomas to increasingly desperate measures. The scene in the dining room where Thomas was finally arrested was surreal in its justice. Federal agents read him his rights while he sat in the same chair where he'd threatened my life just hours earlier, surrounded by the broken china and crystal that symbolized our shattered family relationships. His attempts to maintain dignity during the arrest were pathetic and futile, the desperate performance of a man who had finally been exposed for what he truly was. Janet's arrest followed immediately, her protests about being an innocent victim falling on deaf ears when agents played recordings of her admitting to drugging my food and planning my involuntary commitment. The woman who had played the role of concerned stepmother was revealed as an active participant in every aspect of Thomas's criminal conspiracy. Her tears seemed genuine, but they were tears of self-pity rather than remorse for the pain she'd caused. The scope of Thomas's criminal activities extended far beyond what he'd done to me personally. Federal investigators revealed that he'd been running financial scams against elderly clients for over a decade, stealing retirement funds and life savings from vulnerable people who had trusted him with their financial planning. The inheritance scheme was just the culmination of a career built on manipulation, theft, and abuse of trust. As Thomas was led away in handcuffs, he made one final attempt to manipulate the situation by claiming that everything he'd done was out of love for his family and concern for my welfare. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his words carried no weight against hours of recorded confessions and mountains of documentary proof. The man who had terrorized me for months was finally powerless, reduced to empty threats and desperate lies that convinced no one. The aftermath of Thomas's arrest brought justice that exceeded even my grandfather's careful planning. Federal prosecutors charged him with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, inheritance theft, embezzlement from multiple victims, and a dozen other crimes that ensured he would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The evidence was so overwhelming that his lawyers advised him to plead guilty in exchange for life imprisonment rather than face a trial that might result in the death penalty. Janet received a 15-year sentence for her role in the conspiracy, including the drugging incidents and her participation in the attempted mental health commitment scheme. Her tearful apologies to the court fell on deaf ears when prosecutors played recordings of her laughing about my suffering and planning ways to escalate the psychological torture. The woman who had pretended to be my concerned stepmother was revealed as someone who had enjoyed inflicting pain on a vulnerable young woman. Marcus entered therapy immediately and began the long process of healing from years of manipulation and abuse by his father. The trauma of being forced to participate in crimes against his own sister had left deep psychological scars, but his cooperation with federal investigators and his genuine remorse for his actions earned him community service rather than jail time. Our relationship slowly began to heal as he worked to understand how Thomas had twisted his natural loyalty into a weapon against me. The inheritance that had caused so much suffering became a force for positive change when I established the Harrison Montgomery Foundation for Family Abuse Survivors. Using grandfather's wealth to help other people escape from manipulative and dangerous family situations felt like the perfect way to honor his memory while ensuring that his resources served a meaningful purpose. The foundation provides legal assistance, safe housing, and counseling services to people who have been betrayed by those who should have protected them. Miguel Hernandez was promoted to estate manager with a substantial salary increase and a retirement package that would ensure his family's security for generations. His loyalty to grandfather and his courage in helping me during my darkest hours deserved recognition and reward. Sophia's legal work on my case launched her into national prominence as an advocate for abuse survivors, leading to speaking engagements and opportunities to help reform laws protecting vulnerable family members. The mansion itself was transformed from a place of terror into a sanctuary for healing and growth. I had the interior completely redesigned, removing traces of the nightmare months while preserving the positive memories from my childhood with grandfather. The hidden study in the basement became a library and meditation space where I could feel Harrison's continued presence during difficult moments. Uncle Robert and the family members who had been manipulated by Thomas's lies worked to rebuild relationships based on truth rather than manipulation. The process was slow and sometimes painful, requiring honest conversations about how easily they had been turned against me when presented with convincing lies. But the shared experience of being victimized by Thomas's manipulation created bonds of understanding that grew stronger over time. The restoration of my career happened gradually as the truth about Thomas's frame job became public knowledge. My former employer offered me a significant promotion and a public apology for their handling of the false criminal charges. But I chose to focus my professional energy on running the foundation rather than returning to corporate marketing, finding more satisfaction in meaningful work than climbing the business ladder. A new relationship entered my life through the foundation's work when I met Dr. James Patterson, a trauma counselor who specialized in helping abuse survivors rebuild their lives. James had known me before the inheritance drama began, through mutual friends who introduced us at a charity event months after Thomas's conviction. His interest in me was based on shared values and genuine attraction rather than knowledge of my financial situation, creating the foundation for a healthy partnership built on honesty and respect. The legal protections that grandfather had built into his estate planning proved to be masterfully designed, ensuring that no future attempts to steal my inheritance could succeed. The trust structures and oversight mechanisms he'd established made it impossible for anyone to manipulate me into signing away my rights, even if I had been mentally incapacitated as Thomas had planned. Harrison's foresight protected not just my inheritance but my autonomy and dignity as well. Christmas Eve became a day of remembrance rather than celebration, marking the anniversary of the night when grandfather's spirit had saved my life and delivered justice to those who had betrayed our family. I visited his grave every year on that date, bringing fresh flowers and updates about the Foundation's work. The conversations were one-sided, but I always felt his presence and approval during those quiet moments of reflection. The life lesson that emerged from those dark months was the crucial importance of distinguishing between genuine family loyalty and manipulative control. True family members support each other's growth and independence, while manipulators use emotional bonds as weapons to control and exploit their victims. Learning to recognize the difference between love and manipulation became an essential skill that I shared with other abuse survivors through the Foundation's educational programs. Thomas's story became a cautionary tale about how unchecked greed and entitlement can transform ordinary family conflicts into criminal conspiracies. His willingness to destroy his own daughter for money revealed the hollow core of a man who had never developed genuine love or empathy for anyone beyond himself. The inheritance he'd been so desperate to steal became the source of resources that helped countless other people escape from similar situations. The final lesson that grandfather's ordeal taught me was about the power of preparation and strategic thinking in confronting abuse. Harrison had understood that Thomas's criminal nature would eventually surface, and he'd prepared evidence and legal protections that ensured justice would prevail. His example inspired me to help other potential victims develop their own safety plans and evidence collection strategies before family conflicts escalated into dangerous situations. As I sit in grandfather's restored study today, surrounded by photos of Foundation graduates who have rebuilt their lives after escaping family abuse, I can feel Harrison's pride in how his wealth is being used. The money that Thomas tried to steal through lies and violence now funds legal clinics, safe houses, and educational programs that protect vulnerable people from predators who hide behind family relationships. Justice was served not just through Thomas's imprisonment, but through the transformation of his intended victim into an advocate for others facing similar betrayals. The warmth I felt that freezing Christmas Eve night continues to surround me during difficult moments, reminding me that love and protection can transcend even death when the bonds are genuine and strong. Grandfather's spirit taught me that family isn't defined by blood relationships but by the willingness to protect and support each other through life's greatest challenges. Thomas may have shared my DNA, but Harrison Montgomery was my true family, and his love continues to guide my work helping others find safety and justice. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how families should handle inheritance disputes fairly. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about overcoming family betrayal and finding justice. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who might be facing similar challenges with manipulative family members. Thank you for joining me in honoring my grandfather's memory and supporting abuse survivors everywhere. Remember that no amount of money is worth compromising your values or allowing others to manipulate you through false guilt. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never forget that you deserve to be treated with respect and dignity by the people who claim to love you.